Welcome back to Rooted in Impact, a United Way of Coastal and Western Connecticut podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Gaudiano. Today, we're talking about the power of collaboration and what it means to support children and families from cradle to career. I'm joined by Lauren Scopaz-Daunais, Senior Vice President of Collective Action at United Way, who helped lead our work across Connecticut to bring partners together around shared goals for education, economic mobility, and opportunity. In this episode, we'll explore the Connecticut Cradle-to-Career Coalition, what Cradle-to-Career even looks like, and how communities across the state are working together to align local solutions with statewide policy and advocacy. Lauren, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Ashley. Happy to be here.
So I just rattled off a whole bunch in that intro, and I think the best place to start is just to define what cradle to career means and what that approach even looks like. And then we can dive into what the Connecticut Cradle to Career Coalition looks like.
Sure, happy to do that. And the cradle to career approach is really rooted in collective impact and the principles of collective impact, which start with bringing community together towards a common goal, using data to identify needs and impact, and for accountability and continuous learning, having activities across multiple partners that are aligned and coordinated, continuous communication to build trust and transparency, and finally, the need to have a backbone organization whose job it is to bring folks together to convene and make sure the collaboration happens. And in terms of adapting these collective impact principles to the cradle to career approach, it's really thinking about a way out of poverty through education and ultimately getting children and youth to a living wage job and career. And that education really starts at birth and prenatally with parents who need to be supported and goes all the way until the career. And the cradle to career approach in supporting children towards economic mobility was really started by a national organization called Strive Together that we work with.
So there's a few things there, right? There's kind of what collective impact or collective action mean. You often hear those interchangeably. And then there's also the cradle to career work, looking at how to support children and families from birth to career transition. You mentioned Strive Together, and just quickly, can you tell listeners kind of what the key measures are within Strive Together, right? And so I'm thinking in particular about how do you make sense of what Strive Together is and Cradle to Career and systems change. And there's some key milestones that Strive Together looks at. And I think those kind of make it a little more concrete. So just give an example or two or run through the whole spectrum if it's helpful.
Sure. Yes. The 7 cradle to career milestones are the cornerstone of the work in this cradle to career model and approach because we know that there are different ages and stages of development in a child's life where you need to show progress that shows you're on the right track. And it starts in the early childhood space with kindergarten readiness. Are children ready to learn once they hit school? And there are many different pieces that children go through and develop from 0 to 5. It is the largest area of growth of the brain in those first 5 years. So it's really critical that kids get those developmental supports. And it's easy things like reading and singing to your child and emotional connection with trusted adults. And then it moves to the school-aged outcomes, starting with early grade reading. Reading at 3rd grade is a well-researched indicator of future high school and career success. Similarly, middle grade math and high school graduation are also key markers to future success. And then on the post-secondary side, we look at post-secondary enrollment, post-secondary completion, and then employment, because all of those are critical steps along the cradle to career continuum.
That's really helpful. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea is really for cradle to career partnerships who follow the Strive Together model to bring together community partners around those key milestones. And so, can you give an example, Lauren, around any one of those, how one of the cradle to career partnerships within the state of Connecticut might be convening and really focusing the partnership in the community to better outcomes on one of those indicators?
Sure. And it's hard to choose just one because
I
there's
know we
so
have so
much.
many good ones, but I want to help contextualize for people. I think it's a little bit easier to understand. You might want to direct efforts or energy towards, I don't know, kindergarten readiness, right? But what does that actually mean in practice? And so we could give tons of examples. I'm going to ask you to pick one. And even before I do that, Lauren, can you just share the 5 cradle to career partnerships that exist in the state of Connecticut?
Sure. Yes, we are lucky to have 5 different cradle to career partnerships here in Connecticut. Waterbury Bridge to Success was the first cradle to career partnership in Connecticut following the Strive Together model. And so they are a model for us all. Norwalk Acts, Bridgeport Prospers, Stanford Cradle to Career, all followed quickly after. And then the Danbury Collective is our newest partnership that started about 2 years ago.
Perfect. And so picking one of those and one of those indicators or outcomes along the Strive Together model, can you give an example of what that might look like?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. And since I, previous to this role, worked directly with Stanford Cradle to Career in the local partnership where I live here in Stamford, Connecticut, I'm going to talk about Bridge to College.
Okay.
This was one of the first projects in my role working with Stanford Cradle to Career, and we were addressing a challenge that students are graduating high school, they have the intention to go to college or post-secondary education, but don't end up actually making it into a seat in the fall. And this is a challenge that the school district noted. It's a challenge that our local colleges and community colleges noted, but it's sort of a gap. Who is responsible for supporting this work? And so at Stanford Cradle to Career, and this leveraged our National Strive Together network at a conference, we learned about this great Bridge to College program that's connecting high school and post-secondary through support over the summer. And so in Stanford, we convened our local partners, the school district, after school and youth development programs that are working with youth to help them get them ready for the next step after high school, working with the local community college, Norwalk Community College, and really thinking about what can we do to support children over the summer. And what we ended up doing is securing a small pilot grant to support hiring counselors over the summer, to support students once they graduate. If they have a question, it may just be getting their transcript and they don't know how to do it because the office is closed, or it may be filling out the financial aid application. It may be some little step or barrier around how to pay for college that they are not able to tackle on their own. Usually these students are first generation college students, so they don't have an example in their life to help them through this
Yeah.
process.
Yeah, and so I know that there are other examples, but in essence, you're pulling together community partners across sectors in order to help solve a challenge that's been identified. Again, along those Strive Together measures, and either one of the Cradle to Career partnerships is running that program or service or incubating that, or it's being situated within another organization, school system, governmental body, etc. And then measuring that, right, Lauren? The other key piece of this is that you're actually measuring this work to make sure you can prove out your outcome, whatever that may be. So, what we're going to do, we're going to take a quick break right here. We've covered a lot in the first chunk of this segment, and when we return, we'll continue our conversation here on Rooted in Impact.
Across our region, women are leading the way, raising families, supporting their communities, and creating meaningful change. But we know that leadership and care often come with invisible pressures, especially during challenging times like the holidays. That's where Women United comes in. Through mentorship, volunteer initiatives, and advocacy, Women United empowers women to support one another, strengthen families, and make a lasting impact in our community. By joining, women gain connection, resources, and the opportunity to lift up others while also caring for themselves. You can make a difference and be a part of a network that changes lives. Visit unitedwaycwc.org/Women United to learn more and see how you can get involved today.
All right, welcome back. So, Lauren, you've touched a little bit on what the cradle to career spectrum is, what some of those key outcomes are under the Strive Together umbrella, and you've given us a really great example of something that's happening in Stamford, knowing that amazing work is happening across the state of Connecticut. Now I want to dive into this concept of a cradle to career coalition. What does that mean? And what is being done to pull all 5 cradle to careers together?
Absolutely, Ashley. And the Connecticut Cradle to Career Coalition is an opportunity to pull together the great local work that is happening across our communities to align and support each other and to advocate at the state level for changes that are needed at the state level that really affect the ability to make changes at the local level. And our coalition really works on several levels. It has started by pulling together community of practice to share learnings and best practices across our 5 cradle to career initiatives so that we're not working in silos and we're really learning from each other. Secondly, it also offers an opportunity to develop partnerships at the state level, again, with one voice versus happening 5 times across our partnerships. Third, we are developing some shared infrastructure around key functions such as our data work and our communications work. And finally, and probably the biggest area is around policy and advocacy and saying what's happening and what needs to change at the local level, and then bringing that up to what needs to happen and change at the state level to help our local work to improve.
Yeah, so it sounds like what's happening locally and bringing organizations and cross-sector partnerships together is very similar to what's now happening at scale at the state level. Recognizing we live in Connecticut, 169 towns, in some ways kind of very territorial, but also real opportunity because we are a smaller state for collaboration and partnership and the ability to take that work to a statewide level, I think has the potential to be really powerful. And so, what are you hoping to accomplish, and what is kind of one area that you're really targeting for right now?
Sure, happy to go into that. And for the past several years, we have developed a statewide policy agenda that identifies legislative priorities at the state level that we want to support and advocate for. And there's a number of different areas. The one I will focus on is around early childhood.
Okay.
We had a big win in early childhood in the state last year, last legislative cycle, with the $300 million early childhood endowment that was led by some great statewide advocacy partners. And I think the value that the coalition brought is that local connection to community members, sharing with them what's happening at the state level, helping them understand how to have their voice heard and how to advocate at the state level through events locally, but also through submitting testimony at the state level. And this early childhood work is the cornerstone of the cradle to career work. It's where everything starts in early childhood development. So it's been a great area for us to focus on first as a coalition in a really aligned way, and where really the most aligned and strongest work has been across our Connecticut cradle to career partnerships.
Yeah, because each of the 5 cradle to careers is doing some work individually, right? When they look locally, they're doing work in that early education space, early childhood space. And so you're really now taking that and trying to align it to push for stronger policies And again, that shared learning, I think, is really important. You called it community of practice, but it's really an opportunity to bring together the best of what's happening in each community and make sure that the other cradle to careers can learn from that. Is that kind of an accurate way to look at what you're doing right now?
Absolutely. And the community of practice and shared learning in the early childhood space has been really valuable. We have staff at all levels participating in that, sharing what's happening, what the challenges are, where successes are that we can adapt across our different partnerships. And right now, we've been working for the past several months on an aligned strategy around early childhood. So, how can we be doing the same work across our 5 communities and show the power and impact, not just in one local community, but in 5 communities who follow this cradle to career approach to really be a model for our state?
Yeah, that's great. You touched just briefly on the policy and advocacy piece of this, and you mentioned the kind of power of elevating the voice of community members. And I don't want to gloss over that because that is so core to who the Cradle to Career Coalition is. And so, can you just talk a little bit about what that looks like in practice and how community members are helping to drive the policy and advocacy priorities, and then what that looks like when we're talking about being up in Hartford and testifying on bills?
Absolutely. One of our key driving forces to our cradle to career work is to elevate, encourage, and educate community members. They know the biggest challenges on the ground and also what works, the best solutions, but they're often not listened to, or maybe they don't know how to be heard. And so each of our cradle to career partnerships, in a slightly different way, are supporting and educating both youth and adults around the civic process. So, what does the legislative process look like at both the local level and the state level? Where are there opportunities? Public testimony, written testimony, even just emailing or calling a local representative, and that is important, and that's what those elected officials are meant to do. They're meant to listen to their constituents and then to vote and move policy and practice that supports what community members want. And so it is just a critical piece of the work. And we do this through trainings and workshops with our youth. There's a lot of education and bringing in experts to hear from so that youth really understand their voice is important. And we encourage them to speak out at local Board of Education meetings that are just close to what they're doing and
Yeah,
what's
right
important to
there,
them.
and impact their day to day in a really tangible way.
Yeah, as well as then sharing opportunities at the state level where bigger change happens, but just as important to hear that local voice and helping students and community members write testimony or speak it publicly. And it's just really important. And we use that same strategy to develop our policy agenda for the coalition. And we have a policy and advocacy subcommittee that's made up of youth, community members, partners, and supported by our Cradle to Career staff to ensure their voices are at the table when we're deciding what we advocate for at a state level.
Yeah, it's such critical work. And that process, understanding, knowing how to influence, knowing how to contact a representative can just be so incredibly overwhelming. And it looks different at the municipal, local level, and the state level. So I can't kind of applaud you and the coalition enough for continuing to prioritize that piece of the work. Lauren, we are just about out of time. So I'm actually going to turn to kind of the final question, which, when you look at the work that is happening across community, across the Cradle to Career Coalition, and across the 5 Cradle to Careers, what gives you hope? How do you see that as kind of a big shining star in the work that's happening in the state of Connecticut?
I love that question, Ashley. I see a lot of hope, and it stems from a real desire in our communities to learn from each other, to support each other, to share ideas and practices, and to think beyond what's happening at the local level, knowing that what's happening at the state and even federal level can and will impact any change that we're trying to make at the local level. And I will mention that we've seen a real energy from our policymakers at the state level that this type of coordinated cradle to career approach, connecting the dots and seeing the value of looking at children and their families in a holistic way and not department by department or policy or program by program, but really putting the pieces together. And I think we're building some real momentum at the state that we can do this. We can connect the dots, create a coordinated system that really works for children and families.
I love that. And I agree. There's real energy around this. We were up in Hartford a week or two ago at this point, and we're thrilled to see so many policymakers and staff members engage with the work, because so much does exist in silos right now, and how we interact and treat and engage with children and families sits in multiple different departments. And so I love the energy and the commitment to really bring that all together and focusing on a child from the time that they are born all the way until they hit that post-secondary career transition. So thank you, Lauren, so much for the conversation, for sharing how partners across Connecticut are working together to really advance opportunity, economic mobility for children. I'll just say, to learn more about the Connecticut Cradle-to-Career Coalition, you can visit ctc.org. We'll also put it in the link to this podcast. So thank you for being here with me today. I'm Ashley Gaudiano, and this is Rooted in Impact. Thank you for listening. At United Way of Coastal and Western Connecticut, we work side by side with our community to address critical needs and advance equitable pathways to well-being and financial security for everyone. Rooted in Impact is a podcast that highlights how we are making a difference in our communities. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to learn more about us, visit unitedwaycwc.org. And if you're interested in being our podcast sponsor, we'd love to have you. You can find new episodes every other Tuesday wherever you get your podcasts, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts.